Hello, my name is Stefan Korshak. I'm the Senior Defense Correspondent for Kyiv Post newspaper. Today, our guest is Alexander Vindman, a retired United States Army Lieutenant Colonel. He was a senior official in the Trump administration. Alexander is originally from Ukraine, and now he's back to the country where he was born. His goal is to be useful to Ukraine in the war. This is the second of a two-part interview. You've got a large United States-led support effort to this country. It is clearly delivering some results. And you have a unique insight into both the decision-making process and the analytical process within the United States government decision-making structure that reviewed and thought about Ukraine really with a lot of time in the background. We'd be very curious to hear your view on how the United States has seen Ukraine and its responsibility or maybe national interest to support Ukraine, both over looking back into history. So when you were with the Trump administration, the question would be, the Trump administration approached Ukraine in terms of support and supporting U.S. national interest poorly, well, and then going on from the Trump administration, the Biden administration has had to juggle a lot of different priorities and political needs as well. And one of them has been to try and limit Russian aggression, but another, for instance, has been to mobilize U.S. public support. Yeah. So we'd be very interested to hear what your view of that process and how the United States has gotten to where it is right now in terms of supporting Ukraine, and what you think might be useful for the United States to do in coming days and months and maybe even years.
So how much time do you have? Because I'm writing my doctoral dissertation on U.S. foreign policy towards Russia and Ukraine since '91. So I'll try to keep it brief, but I wrote a very long, 5,000-word essay for Foreign Affairs on this topic, which is quite timely that we can now have this conversation here. Just came out last week. I understand the decisions that were made with regards to Russia and Ukraine over these 30 years pretty well because I've studied it. I would say that in the early portions of this relationship in the 90s, there were hopes and aspirations to bring both Russia and Ukraine into the Western world, integrate into the Western world, into the community of free nations. In the 90s, that was justified for both Russia and Ukraine. And the hope was, and I interviewed President Clinton and Gore, and they wanted to succeed in both. Frankly, in a lot of ways, they succeeded in neither. That transition didn't occur. Major reversals in regards to Russia. So if in the 90s there were hopes, by the time you get to the 2000s and you see what's unfolding in Russia, we should have started looking past our hopes of a good relationship with Russia and start to more accurately consider our fears around a devolving relationship with Russia. At the same time, we should have more fulsomely appraised the opportunities with Ukraine. So if, in fact, Russia was a high priority because its size, its resources, its nuclear weapons, but the relationship is built on false aspirations or misplaced fears. Whereas Ukraine, you have a smaller country, but a critically important country to the region. Where should you apply your resources? Probably not the place where you're not going to achieve much in the way of aims, but the place where you have a willing partnership. Certainly by the time you get to the Orange Revolution, we should have been a little bit more thoughtful about where we put our focus. There were some critical things to do with Russia, arms control, New START, those are all essential. But really, if you look at the agenda, there was not anything else that was accomplished besides some arms control. In the meantime, we lost an opportunity to help nurture democracy in Ukraine. From the Orange Revolution, that was a turning point. It was a turning point both in our relationship with Russia, which became increasingly adversarial, their fears of color revolutions and something being replicated in Russia. But it was a turning point for Ukraine. It kind of, even though it was in fits and starts, there was a reversal under, you had Yushchenko, then you have Yanukovych. There was a way to nurture that relationship, and we passed that opportunity. It's a story of missed opportunities, frankly, running into the 2000s, into the 2010s also. By the time you get to 2014, there was even a more firmly rooted orientation to the West, a firmer break with the history Russian rule and the desire to remain in Russia's orbit. Another huge opportunity. That continued to be the case moving forward. Even under this administration, the Biden administration, we missed some opportunities. We continue to miss opportunities now to make this a short war in Ukraine.
May I interrupt and ask, why do you think that's happening? Obvious to you as a specialist in the region, and I think it's safe to say it's grossly obvious to somebody, to people living here, never mind just the Ukrainians themselves, that greater U.S. engagement and involvement and support should have huge positive results, both for this country and for the security of the region. Yet, looking at Washington's behavior from here, it seems like they simply don't see the opportunity. Or maybe it's there, but they don't act on it. And the question to you would be, well, why do you think they're not acting on it? They being Washington writ large.
There are, as you would imagine, multiple factors, but I'll try to focus in on the principal factors. One is, for a long time, we bought into this notion of Russian exceptionalism. Russia, the largest country, Russia is somehow entitled, not explicitly, but implicitly to a sphere of influence. It's easier to have relationships. If you could have a good relationship with Russia and Russia has a positive influence on the region, we would prefer to have relationships with just the big guys on the block. It's kind of almost the nature of the French conduct their foreign policy entirely on this basis of great powers. They kind of overlook Central and Eastern Europe entirely for this reason. So that's kind of just kind of a functional issue. This idea of exceptionalism. There was also this idea that in having much closer relations with Ukraine, we could have challenged our poor relations with Russia even further. So it's this Moscow factor that we didn't want to, burn all our bridges with Russia, even past the point of time where it's clear that we're headed to a confrontation. By not supporting Ukraine, slowly moving towards a confrontation. If that's the trajectory, let's say from 2000 on, under the Trump administration, we didn't creep, we lurched into a confrontation. Because I think for Putin and his mindset, this was a seminal moment. It was a milestone. It showed that the U.S. wouldn't necessarily be there. Support was not ironclad. It showed that political expediencies would trump, I guess pun intended, national security.
You're talking about, I think, the absence of a strong U.S. reaction to Russian annexation of Crimea.
But it's not just that. It's also the fact that there's no question that was critically important. But it's also during the Trump administration with the impeachment, the first impeachment scandal, which is basically the president looking to extract a investigation into the Bidens for domestic political
tying
gains.
Military aid to that
It was the fact that Trump really didn't like Ukraine for no real reason. He just didn't like it. And that he carried a Republican Party along with him. We shouldn't have any misconceptions. The support, bipartisan support for Russia is not the same that it used to be. There's a whole Trump faction that doesn't feel the same way about Ukraine as historically it would have. And this is all the result of Donald Trump. He also made Ukraine radioactive even for the Dems, for the Democratic Party, because Biden didn't want to keep engaging with Ukraine when he was going to continue to get painted with this brush of completely false conspiracies around Hunter Biden. So it was easier to keep it away. The only reason that I think the administration turned hard and started to engage in the summer of 21 is because they saw the warning signs and they needed to have that kind of engagement. But even so, President Biden hasn't visited this country yet, and I talked about this yesterday on NBC News. He should. This is the most pressing, important geopolitical event to occur over the past 20 years, potentially longer, maybe 30 years since the collapse of the Soviet Union, and it's probably going to be the most important one for the next 10 or 20 years. It's going to be the one that determines the footing, U.S. geopolitical footing going forward. If Russia wins,
the security structure of the entire region.
But the security structure of the entire region and norms-based international order, whether China feels emboldened to attack Taiwan, whether Iran decides to be more militarily aggressive.
Whether the U.S. remains a leader.
These are the stakes in play. That's why it's absolutely essential to provide more support to Ukraine. And we're kind of inching in that direction, But we've passed up an opportunity to make this a short war. Like I said, we could have offered HIMARS and longer range capabilities, unmanned aerial vehicles earlier, when it would have completely foreclosed on a Russian theory of victory. If they were crushed at every point in this 6 months, they would have found a way to save face and leave, because that's the way they respond to strength. But because they now have a theory of victory, they were able to secure Luhansk. They focused all of their resources in one spot. There's a theory of victory. There's a way to punish Ukraine. There's a way to potentially wait out the Western world to see if Ukraine fatigue sets in, or if the Republicans take the House. That's the aperture that's been offered by not doing more early on. This is what I've been urging the U.S. government to do more early, because it's the lack of action that's going to precipitate issues, not the too much action.
The real world, where the ideal amount of the most action needed is not going to take place. In the real world, in the next year, maybe even 2 years, what do you see happening, and where do you see this conflict going? But everybody wants to know, when's this war going to end? Everybody hates it, and they want it to end. What do you think?
One of the things I'm coming around to is that this is going to be easily another 6 months, potentially longer. Catastrophic success in Kherson might force the Russians to fall back on maintaining a land bridge, maintaining their holdings in Luhansk, stopping the offensive, and just kind of defending. That would significantly shorten their needs to defend across 800 kilometers. I think more than likely, it's probably going to be a scenario where Russia takes huge punishment. Ukraine continues to take some punishment, but not nearly as bad as it was in the worst days of this war in the East. Russia may be forced to move to not just a covert mobilization, not looking for volunteer battalions, but a general mobilization. Over the course of 6 months or a year, the dangers to the U.S. increase manyfold.
Why?
The dangers of an accident or miscalculation, the dangers of the Russians striking out, actually causing a nuclear catastrophe in like the Zaporozhye nuclear power plant, the Russians probing for weaknesses, as they always do, looking for vulnerabilities where they try to interdict logistics coming through, testing the resolve of the U.S. to defend NATO potentially, warning off various NATO members on their individual support, because various countries are doing more, some are doing less, precipitating some other crisis somewhere else to distract the U.S. This is what happens in a long war scenario. That there are these, kind of hard to foresee. You could see the outlines of these factors starting to creep in, and this puts the U.S. in a lot more danger than a scenario in which Ukraine wins relatively decisively. Russia goes back, and this is not a far-fetched notion. Russia kind of licks its wounds and looks for another day to fight. Right now, Russia has not put its regime survival at stake. In a general mobilization scenario, it does. Then the whole country is mobilized, and if it doesn't win, then Putin's responsible. Right now, it's still a special military operation. I think there's going to be more skin in the game on the Russian side, more skin in the game on the U.S. and NATO side over the course of 6 months. The stakes will increase, and that's just a recipe for disaster. But that's what's going to happen now. That's where we are, because it's going to be another 6 months. A year from now, it could be even more dangerous. Because then, the Russians are deeply frustrated and start to think, okay, how do we win this? How do we pull a rabbit out of a hat? And that's when you start having concerns over escalation to weapons of mass destruction. A long war scenario is kind of a nightmare scenario for Ukraine and for the U.S. That's why doing more now makes a great deal of sense to me.
Okay, well, then just to lead you into what I think that you were just about to say, if a long war scenario is not, in your view, in the U.S. interest, in your view, what should the United States be doing, and I guess, and NATO, but led by the United States, in order to avoid a long war scenario?
Unfortunately, I think we may have that window for a shorter war scenario is closed. A lot of the things that we could do now don't necessarily obviate a 6 month or a year-long scenario, because now we have to ride this out and try to manage crises as they unfold. It's really quite frustrating because I watched this war unfold starting in the fall of last year, in October, November, I started talking about it publicly. I sounded like some crazy guy, although within my community, people understood me and knew who I was and didn't necessarily think I was too far in left field. But I was adamant that we needed to do more to avoid the war and that war was coming. And I wrote an article in the New York Times. I basically laid out how the Russians were going to attack in January. So I've been seeing this train wreck kind of unfold and doing the best I can to avoid it. And it's just deeply frustrating watching us kind of plod through in this manner. So now we're almost locked into a longer war scenario. And we still need to provide Ukraine with more of these advanced weapon systems. By my calculation, the U.S. alone should provide 32 2-battalion sets, plus whatever our other NATO allies are producing. That'll be 3. They'll cover the 3 major directions: Kharkiv, the east, and the south. 32 HIMARS, just the U.S. alone, and then a sufficient amount of ammunition to basically allow them to fire whenever they need to, not have to be overly cautious about running out. And then the longer range versions, not 80 kilometers, but 300 kilometers, that should be in play. The Ukrainians have proven the fact that they can be responsible, and I think we should be able to trust them as allies, that they'll be responsible with those weapons. They're going to go after militarily relevant targets. We should offer unmanned combat aerial vehicles. I've been pressing on this issue from the very beginning, since frankly, probably since even before this war. We should start thinking about fixed-wing aircraft like F-16s and F-15s. That's on the military front. We should build logistics bases here, again, manned by contractors, so like things could get repaired and sustained quickly. We could protect those bases like we did in Iraq and Afghanistan with point defense systems that make them invulnerable to like cruise missile strikes. That's a completely reasonable thing to do. And then that's just on the military side. On the political side, further isolate Russia. We should increase our sanctions. I think by the end of this year, Europe is going to be close to weaned off of Russian gas. It's amazing. That's where we are. But that we need to make sure we hit those markers and ease the blow for Europe, because it's going to be a cold winter. I've talked to the right people, and nobody's going to freeze to death, but industry might not be working on 100% capacity. We should isolate Russia's ability to sell oil and gas significantly. I'm not sure if I'd call for a full kind of gas embargo. There's a way to price cap what their revenues are and still, feed people's homes and countries, industries, and so forth. I had, as a former diplomat, I had some reluctance about the designation of state sponsor of terror of the largest country in the world, but I think I'm over it now.
Yeah,
I've encouraged that. I guess I don't have to deal with the consequences. I understand what those would be. You basically can't really have relations anymore. But there's some wishful thinking about what those relations with Russia would be. Economically, you start to think through what reconstruction looks like. It does not have to wait until all shots are, until a complete truce. Kyiv and the suburbs here in Chernihiv should absolutely be under reconstruction right now. You could use asset seizures from Russian central bank to pay for that. You could, and then thus warn off the Russians from doing more damage. You should also start to think about, in a much, much more comprehensive manner, the enormous amounts of resources required to rebuild. And that's going to be grants, because Ukraine shouldn't be burdened with enormous loans after they basically saved the world order for us. So I'd like to see a large number of grants, transfers from the EU because of the EU accessions protocols. Those are also going to, by the way, help achieve some major gains with anti-corruption and reform, because there'll be benchmarks. And at the same time, so you have European transfers, you have Marshall Plan, you have asset forfeitures that will seed public-private partnerships, and you're building confidence. Right now, I see it actually. I know that there's some industry here from the West looking at this, but you're starting to build confidence in investments here, in foreign direct investments. And that's how you bring this country, military tiger, to an economic tiger, and an engine for growth and development and prosperity, not just for Ukraine, but for Europe.
Okay, well, then that leads me very smoothly to my last question, and that is, in order for something like a Marshall Plan to take place, in order for European business to engage deeply, in order for the reconstruction that you're talking about to actually begin and continue, there has to be will, primarily on the part of the United States, and not just the political elite, if you will, but the public that pays for everything. Is that there? Do the Americans, written large, have the will to stay the course that Ukraine needs? What do you think, and why?
So I think part of this starts with the Ukrainian will and us, capturing some of that and bottling that up, because Ukraine's captured the energy and attention of the world. It's starting to wane. It means really good, thoughtful decisions by Ukraine's leadership. I think it means that there's an opportunity right now to reformat the direction of this country. There's a lot of history and baggage with regards to corruption. There's an opportunity to turn the page. Nobody's going to forget about what happened in the past, but there's an opportunity for people to, basically move in a different direction. Even if they were, malign actors, they could rebrand themselves as Ukrainian patriots. So I would like to see this government make some really major steps, because we shouldn't completely forget about, this corruption question, even in the midst of this war. I'd like to see this government go after stolen assets from, that means potentially going after oligarchs. That's a tough thing to do, but that would be a great thing to see them do. Start to take some steps on the anti-corruption track. Some of those are starting to unfold. We have new anti-corruption investigators and so forth. On the U.S. side, part of the reason I'm here is because I do have the same concerns about the U.S. kind of the attention being, in a lot of ways, actually legitimately competed for. We have the January 6th insurrection committee, all over the TV. We have elections. We have sensitive classified documents. That's all going to compete for the attention in the media space. By being here and announcing I was here, even not waiting until after I leave and generating some attention, I'm able to kind of do some little things to put it back in the media kind of environment. It was a leading story on NBC yesterday. I mean, I'm prepared to do that, to be helpful and come up with some creative ideas to keep it at the forefront of Americans' minds. I think the outreach from senior leadership here will still generate national interest, but there is an opportunity to engage locally also between Ukrainian leadership, whether it's sister city programs, Ukrainian leadership talking to various constituencies, maybe through our House of Representatives that represent those constituencies, or senators. There's a smart way to do strategic communications to keep Ukraine at the forefront. In addition, arming Ukraine, potentially capture the headlines because Ukraine's successful in liberating Kherson or something like that. Those are the types of things I think would be. Those are some ideas, at least.
Well, let's hope it pans out that way. All right. Well, this has been Stefan Korshak with Alexander Vindman. Thank you very, very much. It's been a pleasure.
Thank you, Stefan. Appreciate it.